We're fortunate to have with us the independent candidate for president of the United States, the Honorable Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And since we at Our Country, Our Choice are about uniting people, we're very anxious to hear from him because he's the only man out there who's talked about uniting us across party lines. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Yeah, Doug, I'm very very excited. Of course, you've been a really good just a counselor to me, an advisor, and I rely on you for so much advice. And you've got such wisdom about so many things, and are thoughtful, and we share the aspiration of winding down the warfare state and actually making America strong again in the way that countries actually get strong, which was by building an economy and by moral authority abroad and an ability to compete and have our own industrial base. And you're such an important asset to me in formulating the way that I think about these things. So I'm grateful to you. The interesting thing is, when I made my announcement in Boston in April, the thing I said I was going to do, and I committed to myself, is to unite this country. You and I have talked about the fact that we're more polarized today, probably than any other time since the American Civil War. We saw this kind of polarization in the 1960s too, and people don't recall that there was a lot of violence then. You had cities burning, over 100 cities burning. You had federalized troops who were shooting kids on campuses. Really violent fights and protests, happening all over the country. You had bombings from the Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, and so there was a lot of polarization then too. But I have a sense that the polarization today is more dangerous than we've ever seen, probably because of the amplification that it gets from the social media, and that it's being deliberately and purposely amplified by these algorithms that people seem to have completely lost control over. But so my objective was to do what my dad did. My dad tried to do the same thing when he ran in 1968, which is to bring people together, and he succeeded during that short campaign. He was only out there for 3 months before he was killed. But the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in our country, which is South Dakota, and he won the most urban state, which is California. And he brought people together, on the funeral train when we took him from New York. I was with him when he died, but we took him from New York to Washington, D.C., because we had waked him at St. Patrick's. And that ride was supposed to be 2.5 hours. It turned out to be 7.5 hours because there were 2 million people on the train tracks. And they were an entire cross section of the American experience. They were whites. There were tens of thousands of Black Americans at Trenton and in the urban train stations. And we went through those train stations at 1 mile an hour with the windows open. And they were singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was the song that they had sung when Lincoln took his last train ride across the country. In Trenton and Newark and Philadelphia and Wilmington, in Baltimore, and then in the countryside, there were people in military uniform. There were Boy Scouts standing in salute at attention. There was hippies in tie-dye. There were, I remember seeing outside of Wilmington in a field, an empty field, there was a yellow pickup truck with 7 nuns in the back waving rosaries at us, and there were people holding signs up that said, "Goodbye, Bobby, pray for us, Bobby." People holding American flags, and it was this incredible amalgamation of, the entire melting pot of America. And I remember 4 years later, I was at college in Boston and I was studying politics, and I came across polling data that showed almost all of those white people who supported my father and had stood by that train tracks in Baltimore and Pennsylvania and New Jersey during the 1968 election, that 4 years later, they voted not for George McGovern, who was very much aligned politically with my father, but instead for George Wallace, overwhelmingly, who was antithetical to everything my father believed in. He was a rampant racist and segregationist and a very, very divisive figure. And it occurred to me, and it struck me many times since, that every individual, like every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. And the easiest thing for politicians to do is to use all the alchemies of demagoguery, the hatred and anger and misogyny and xenophobia and racism, etc., and to mobilize that darker side. And then my father really tried to do something different, which was to get people to see the hero in themselves, to take the risk of being part of a community, of saying, we have to avoid the seduction of the notion that we can advance ourselves as a nation by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind. And that made people feel kind of a brotherhood or sisterhood with people who had different skin colors. And that takes courage from people, because the easiest thing for you to do, when you're being manipulated by fear particularly, is to retreat into that tribalism. And those buttons are very easy to press for people, for demagogic leaders. They have an instinct for finding that part of the American. So I try to do the same thing. One of the techniques my father did was just to tell the truth to people. And that's one of the reasons for the division today, is that everybody is unsure of what to believe. Because we're being lied to by our government, we're being lied to by the media. All these institutions that we built that were part of the democratic superstructure of our country have now turned predatory against the American people, and they're lying to us. And people need to hear the truth. And if they're lying, then people seek their own, truth, and the places they go are places that will reinforce or validate their existing worldviews and their bigotries and their prejudices. And so I made this commitment, number one, that I'm going to tell the truth to people, and whatever the cause or however impolitic it is. And that also I'm not going to, that I'm going to look for, I try to identify the values that hold us all together rather than focus on these issues that keep us apart. The culture war issues, they're all important issues: guns, abortion, climate, immigration. But what I found, Doug, is that there's a much, much larger landscape out there of commonality. And, you talk to Americans and you begin to understand it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat or white or black. Everybody wants to take care of veterans. Everybody wants to take care of their families and make sure they have good housing and decent food and good health care, particularly from the VA. Everybody wants our children, our education system to be the best in the world. Everyone wants to take care of teachers and to make sure that our kids are receiving good education, whether they're black or white. Everybody wants that. Everybody wants to end the corrupt merger between state and corporate power. And they want, our regulatory agencies not to be sock puppets for the industries that they're supposed to regulate, but to actually protect the public interest. People want to end the warfare state. Everybody will say that. People will have different ideas about how to do it. and how to keep America strong. But most people don't want to be in wars. They don't think that's the job of the president, to keep us in constant wars. And they understand that, the role of the intelligence agencies have become captive agencies as well. The Pentagon is a captive agency. The Fed is a captive agency. It serves the interests of Wall Street and the banks, and not what it was created to do, which is to serve, to avoid economic or financial crises and deflation. But it's been captured, and its capacity to print money has now been deployed on behalf of this Wall Street oligarchy and the corporate kleptocracy that is now, into which our democracy has devolved. Everybody wants to protect the environment. If you talk about climate change, you're going to divide people. If that's the only thing you can talk about. But if you talk about habitat protection, if you talk about safeguarding our sacred places, if you talk about ending toxic chemicals that have now permeated our food, our water, our air, everybody wants that. When we did the demonstrations and the protests in Flint, Michigan, we had Hell's Angels standing shoulder to shoulder with urban black leaders. The same was true at Standing Rock, because we didn't try to sell Standing Rock as a climate issue. We sold it as this is interference with sacred place of this, of the Lakota Indians. And it was amazing the people who showed up for that. You had Republican businessmen and Wall Street people. And you had people from every walk of life in our country, people who'd never met an Indian before. But they wanted that. And, if you talk about the Appalachian Mountains, about strip mining the Appalachians, right now, we're detonating enough, the equivalent amount of ammonia nitrate explosives. There's three companies, mainly Consol, Peabody, and Massey Coal, that together detonate the equivalent amount of ammonia nitrate explosives every day in the Appalachians, the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb. And they're blowing the tops off the mountains. They've already leveled the 500 biggest mountains in West Virginia. And they flattened an area larger than the state of Delaware. They buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams. These are the landscapes that, were Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett from. These were the landscapes that, Sergeant York came from, and so many of our Medal of Honor winners and military heroes. They're the landscapes that spawned NASCAR racing and country music and bluegrass music. And so much of our culture is wrapped up in the Purple Mountains majesty. And we're cutting them down, and no American wants that. And if you talk about climate, and you try to show people a line on a graph and say the apocalypse is here if you keep doing what you're doing. We need you to give up your job. We need you to pay more for this and that. Nobody wants to do that, and they're not going to be convinced. But if you show them the Appalachians and you say every freshwater fish in America now has dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. Mm. If you say that, the Appalachians, acid rain has destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia to northern Quebec, people are upset. I grew up fishing and hunting in the Adirondacks, the oldest protected wilderness on earth. It was a jewel of, American pride in terms of, our identification with the wilderness that democracy came out of that wilderness and made Americans into bred in us this beef jerky toughness that was part of our heritage. And today, and we had a right, because it was the oldest protected wilderness on earth, to believe that generations of Americans would be able to fish there and hunt there and camp there and enjoy it. But today, 1 out of every 5 lakes in the Adirondacks is sterilized from acid rain. And I'm watching, I grew up on the coast of New England, and I'm watching the bivalve population, the oysters, the quahogs, the clams collapse because the water is now so acidic, the salt water of the ocean, that they can't mobilize calcium out of the water column to build their shells. Well, nobody wants that. And if you talk about those issues, people respond, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, and say, we need to do something different. And so I try to talk about those issues, and, people are responding. I try to talk about the fact that kids today, have no faith in our country. I don't know if you saw this poll, but there was a poll, one of the most disturbing polls I've seen. In 2013, they polled American kids 18 to 34, and they asked them if they were proud of the United States of America, and 85% said yes, which to me is almost low, and it's predictable, right? They did the same poll last month, and 18% of young Americans said they were proud. So we have somehow lost the faith in our country and the administrations of the last two presidents of an entire generation of kids who not only no longer has faith in our country, but they have no hope for their own lives. They're looking at, none of it, they can't afford a house. None of these kids are going to be in a house. And and I know that was just part of the, American promise, the American dream when you and I were growing up. If you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could finance a home, you could take a summer vacation, you could put something aside for your retirement, you could raise a family on one job.
Yes.
There's nobody in this generation that believes that promise applies to them. We broke it. We have betrayed this generation. And you and I know how it happened. We spent $8 trillion on wars, and since 2001, and $16 trillion on COVID lockdowns, which were just an assault on young people. It was just a war on young people, and they know it, and they feel betrayed, and we have to acknowledge our betrayal of them. And one of the key elements of my campaign and my central promise is I'm going to put that generation in homes. And that's how, after World War II, at the time you and I grew up, there was a 50-year period we called the Great Prosperity, when the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. We owned, when my uncle was president, half the wealth on the face of the earth was American. And we were the biggest exporter of goods in the world. Everybody wanted our stuff. Everybody wanted our blue jeans and our transistor radios and our RCA Victrolas and our, Ford automobiles and Cadillacs. And it was the gold standard of everything. Everybody looked to FDA. These other nations, they didn't have their own FDA. They didn't have their own NIH. They wanted to approve a drug. They put it in their law. If FDA approves it, it's good, right?
Yes,
so they didn't have the ability to do that research. They looked to our institutions as the gold standard for everything. And in 1780, we were the first democracy in the modern era, the only one on earth. By 1860, there were 6, all modeled on us, on what we did. By the mid-1960s, there are 180. And they were all modeled themselves on us. They took our Constitution and adapted it. They used our attorneys to come over to their countries to write constitutions, to build the democratic institutions. Oh, and our betrayal has not only been against this generation, but the entire world. We're supposed to be the exemplary democracy, and we aren't. And we have an obligation to rebuild that. But one of the primary reasons that we had all this prosperity after World War II, of course, there were geopolitical reasons. All of the industrial base of Europe had been obliterated by bombs. And ours hadn't. So we had the ability to produce things. But even more importantly, we got every American into a home. We had the GI Bill. And when you own a home, and there was a bunch of other instrumentalities that got Americans into homes. When you own a home, you have a different relationship to your community because you care about your community. You care about the hospitals, you care about the schools, you go to the PTA meetings, you care about the police protection, you care about the appearance, and you care about your neighbors. But more importantly, you have a stake in an economic entree to the capitalist system because now you can borrow money. You have equity. If you want to start a business, whether it's a restaurant or a retail outlet or a yoga shop, you can borrow money on that home and do it. And that home ownership, this broad home ownership after World War II, created this economic ferment where Americans were able to follow their entrepreneurial impulses. It's what Franklin Roosevelt called America's industrial genius. It gave them the potential to turn that genius into industries and into shops and that rebuilt our country. And now we're going the opposite direction. We're going from an ownership society to a rental society. And when we do that, we go from being citizens to being subjects. And,
well, in the United States today, the man who tells the truth is a revolutionary.
Yeah.
You sound like a revolutionary to me, and I think that's what most people are concluding. I wondered if you'd just tell us briefly, what are you going to do in the first few months of your presidency? What are the top 2 or 3 things that you want to do right away?
The first day, I'm going to pardon Julian Assange and pardon Edward Snowden. I'm going to issue a federal order that no federal official or employee can collude with social media sites to censor political speech in this country. I'm going to issue another order that will get rid of pharmaceutical advertising on television. I'm going to I'm going to go down to Bethesda to NIH, and I'm going to say, look, we spend $42 billion, which each year, which we distribute to 56,000 scientists, and it used to be for pure science, for good science, to figure out how to make Americans live better. And now it is, we spend that money to advance the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical industry. NIH has turned into an incubator for pharmaceutical drugs. And they're the biggest incubator. And the industry also, or the NIH, the other thing it does gain of function studies, and which is essentially, as you know, bioweapons development. So it's, trying to make bugs, trying to make zoonotic microbes more pathogenic and more virulent. When does a public health agency do that? And that's what we're spending money. And I'm going to say, okay, we're going to give infectious disease a little bit of a break for 8 years, and we're going to spend that money trying to figure out why we have the sickest kids in the world. Why has autism gone from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 34 kids? In my generation, it's still, to this day, 1 in 10,000. Oh, and yet, why did food allergies suddenly appear? Why are there EpiPens in every classroom? Why are these autoimmune diseases breaking out? The rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, all these exotic diseases like Crohn's disease. Why did they suddenly explode in 1989? Why do our kids all have neurological disease? Why do we have the highest chronic disease burden in the world? Why is obesity increased from 6% when my uncle was president to 42% today, with 75% of this generation, this next generation, my kids' generation, overweight or grotesquely obese? What happened? My uncle, President Kennedy, did this really interesting article in 1961 called I think it was called The Softening of America, and he was concerned then at our physical fitness of that generation was way behind Europe in measures of strength, of coordination, of endurance, that we already were falling behind. And so he launched the President's Council on Physical Fitness. I grew up with that. I grew up, competing, and we all had to do pull-up contests and push-up contests. And, today, no kid could reach any of those metrics, in high school. Very, very rare for anybody to make those metrics. And American kids did not suddenly become lazy. Something happened. They're being mass poisoned, and we need to find out what it is. And it could be high fructose corn syrup. It could be, there's all of these different culprits, and we need to identify them, and then we need to eliminate them. And that's what I'm going to do right now. The biggest cost, the second biggest cost, is military expenditures, which have gone from, we were told we were going to cut back to about $500 billion in 1993. Or now, if you add the national security, we're at 1.3 trillion, right?
Yeah.
and the veterans. But the biggest cost is healthcare. So we've gone, when my uncle was president, 6% of people had chronic disease. Today, by 1986, that was 11.8%. By 2006, that was 54%. And NIH now won't tell us. They won't publish the data anymore, but we're probably around 60%. And you've got all of these kids you've got a whole generation that is sick. That's the sickest generation on earth today of any country, and the sickest generation in American history. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about why our children have so many diseases. And by the way, in COVID, we had the highest body count of any country in the world. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in the United States, and we only have 4.2% of the global population. I don't know why people are getting awards, for this. Clearly, a lot of that had to do with terrible management. But the other thing is, it hit us worse because of the chronic disease epidemic. In fact, CDC has said that the average American who died of COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had obesity, they had diabetes, they had asthma, and one other thing. And, this is what our country looks like today, and nobody's doing anything about it. And I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to end the chronic disease epidemic.
Well, somebody asked President Truman what his big problem was when he spoke to audiences. He said, well, I just tell them the truth and they think it's hell. It sounds to me like you're in that great tradition. And I know that Stephanie will shoot me and never allow me to interview you again if I don't try to sign off at this point. And I don't want to, because I could listen for another 2 or 3 hours, as I'm sure everybody in my organization would. But it's been refreshing. And we hope that you will continue to tell the truth and give them hell.
Thank you. And I told Stephanie, I didn't really have time to do this interview today. And I said, I can't say no to Doug Macgregor. Whenever he asks me anything, I got to say yes. So the answer is yes. But thanks for letting me off the hook this early. I appreciate it, Doug.
Well, the same is true for me, sir. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your patriotism and your honesty. It's so refreshing. And it's so important because there aren't too many people out there like you. There's Scott Ritter, who's telling the truth about stuff. There's you, and there's not too many people that are willing from that military who have credentialed military officers, and you're one of the great war heroes of American history. And I'm sure everybody knows that Colonel Macgregor led the greatest tank battle in the modern era. And I saw so much cowardice in the military ranks during COVID, of people putting their careers ahead of the welfare of their troops. And it was terrible. My father talked a lot. He had such admiration for physical courage, and him and his brothers all joined during World War II. He lost one of his brothers, his eldest brother Joe, who was the great hope for our family. His other brother, Jack Kennedy is the only president to have served ever who's won the Purple Heart, and he was missing in action, presumed dead for after his PT boat got cut into by a Japanese destroyer in the Blackett Straits and the Solomon Island. My father joined, could not get into action, but was on a ship during the last year of the war. And, he's one of that generation that was wanted to serve his country on the front lines of the battlefield. Teddy served in the Korean War. But they surrounded us when we were growing up with war heroes. It was like the highest accolade that he could give people is people who had, Americans who had made sacrifice or taken great risks during war. And we were absolutely, our house was filled with, the Green Berets where, my uncle, Jack is the father of the Green Berets. He created the Navy SEALs. And they also, other people who had demonstrated their physical bravery. My father's best friends included John Glenn, who was the first American in space, and Jim Whittaker, who was the first American on Mount Everest, Gerald Tremblay, who had been the biggest ace during the Korean War, and many, many other people who had, extraordinary physical courage or had courage in wartime, but they always said that the rarest commodity is moral courage, and that it's much, much, much rarer than physical courage. And I see all of these military officers who, I have such great admiration for because of their physical courage. When it came to moral courage during COVID, we saw, we saw some really dismaying behavior. So I want to thank you for standing out in that crowd, standing out once again among your military brothers and sisters for extraordinary courage. So thank you, Doug.
Oh, thank you, sir. And we'll need lots of moral courage where we're headed, but I'm sure with you in charge, we'll get it. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving and God bless.
You too. God bless you and God bless our country.
Yes, sir.